So part 2, proposed amendment analysis. Justice Scalia gave a warning in May of 2015. He says a constitutional convention is a horrible idea. This is not a good century to write a constitution. What does he have against this century? What's his concern here? I think that's probably best illustrated by looking back to history when we were a very different people. In the early 1800s, this French philosopher and author, Alexis de Tocqueville, came to America to discover what made America great. What was our secret to our overnight success? He pointed to our miraculous Constitution as being definitely a backbone to it. But more specifically, he said that in America, every citizen is taught the history of his country and the leading features of its Constitution. It's extremely rare to find a man imperfectly acquainted with all these things, and a person wholly ignorant of them is sort of a phenomenon. Everybody understands our national history and our Constitution. Does that sound like today? Not at all. If I were to apply this to today, I'd have to reverse it and say today it's extremely rare to find a man who is vaguely acquainted with all these things. And a person wholly educated on them is sort of a phenomenon. What was our great strength in the early 1800s is our great weakness today. This is not a good century to be writing a constitution. I totally agree. Whether in whole or in part, even amending a constitution, you'll see, could cause tremendous concern and damage. I compare it to inviting a love poet who is an expert in matters of the heart to perform heart surgery. Is that a great idea? Very likely, rather than doing any help, they'll likely kill the patient in the process. In the same way, if we have people who are totally ignorant of what our Constitution already says, performing heart surgery to our Constitution, they're very likely to kill our Constitution in the process. The Convention of States organization has demonstrated this for us very nicely. They did us a great favor. In September of 2016, they held this historic simulation of an Article 5 convention, what we call the mock convention, where they invited delegates from all 50 states, mostly state legislators, to come together in colonial Williamsburg to pretend to role play through an Article 5 convention. In this convention, here are some of the details. Number one, this was by invitation only, and most were Convention of States bill sponsors in their home states. So a lot of their own people were the delegates. Number two, Convention of States paid all the expenses for everyone that attended. Next, the Convention of States wrote the rules for the convention, whereas in a real convention, the convention writes their own rules, decides their own ground rules from the beginning. Here's an interesting one. Convention of States leaders were on hand in the committees guiding the drafting of the amendments that came out of this convention. Just like a real convention will be, right? I doubt that. And since it was just a simulation, they had no real power and therefore no temptation to abuse such power. And in like manner, there weren't the myriad of lobbyists there trying to get their views inserted into the changes being made to the Constitution. The only lobbyist group that was there was Convention of States themselves, which were definitely on hand. In the end, we see that they had 137 delegates to this convention. I personally went through and researched every one of those delegates to determine what their political affiliation was. And I discovered that only 4 of the 137 were Democrats. There was one Republican turned libertarian, and all the rest were Republican or at least conservatives by strong standing. This is a very imbalanced convention. In fact, I would refer to this as a fantasy dream team for conservatives for a convention. Nothing like the real convention will be. We'll see far more moderates and liberals there than we will see true conservatives. But just the same, what came out of this imbalanced convention is very shocking. Let me show a few of the examples of what they came up with. They came up with a total of 6 amendment proposals. We'll start with this one, the lame duck amendment. Y'all know what a lame duck session of Congress is? After the election in November, prior to the next session of Congress, those who are not reelected, yet they're still in office in Congress, now have no incentive to listen to the will of their voters. They're on their way out. You've got nothing to do for them. This is the time when the politically unpopular bills are easiest to pass. Why? What is their motivation? Who are they listening to during lame duck session? If they don't need to listen to their voters anymore, the only other voice that really has much bearing on them are the lobbyists, the special interest groups. And they have a much greater time now of getting unpopular bills through Congress. This is a terrible idea. Typically, the lame duck session of Congress lasts for about 1 month, and if I were to make any changes to this situation, I would suggest we need to eliminate it. Maybe allowing a provision for times of emergency, like Congress needs to have a special session to discuss whether or not to declare war, if they were still doing that thing. But rather than eliminating the lame duck situation, this mock convention suggested that we should expand it. A little shocking. Extending the lame duck session for the House of Representatives to 2 years, and for the Senate, let's extend it to 6 years. Is that shocking? How did they get a massively conservative delegation to vote to extend the lame duck session, and it passed with a 70% majority? How did they sell them on that? It's very simple, actually. It's all about packaging. You don't call it a lame duck amendment. You call it term limits. Now give this an honest assessment for a moment. What do term limits do? Once someone is term limited in office, let's say I'm your US congressman and I'm just entering into my final term of 2 years, and I now have 2 years where I have no incentive to listen to the will of the people because I have no chance for re-election. I am now a lame duck congressman for my entire 2-year final term. Or if I'm in the Senate, that's 6 years. That is the same thing. In fact, our founding fathers, under the Articles of Confederation, they had term limits. And they recognized this to be a great error. When they formed the new Constitution, they explained this very thing. This is why we're eliminating term limits. Let's use some of their words specifically here. Alexander Hamilton says, "Nothing appears more plausible at first sight, nor more ill-founded upon close inspection, than term limits. One ill effect of the exclusion would be a diminution, a reducing, of the inducements to good behavior." They no longer have to listen to the people, right? Rather than when they were permitted to entertain a hope of obtaining, by meriting, a continuation in office. As long as they have a chance to be re-elected, they have an inducement to good behavior. We're getting rid of that with term limits. That's why he explained in Federalist 72 why they had eliminated it from the Constitution. During the Constitutional Convention, when they're debating whether or not to keep term limits, Gouverneur Morris took the floor and explained to him why he felt we need to eliminate it. And this is the argument that won the day. Term limits tended to destroy the great motive to good behavior, the hope of being rewarded by reappointment. It was saying to him, "Make hay while the sun shines." Next, let's turn to John Adams, who gives also some great advice on this topic. "The people should be at liberty to choose the ablest and best men. Yet upon the present term limit supposition, the people voluntarily resign this right and shackle" who? They're shackling their own choice. Who do term limits limit? They limit the will of the people. The people should be at liberty to choose whomever they desire to elect to office. Term limits take away the choice from the people. And finally, Thomas Jefferson. "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take this power from them, but to inform their discretion by" what? Education. And his concluding line here is very key. He says, "This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power." What is he saying is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power? You don't take the power of the vote away from the people through term limits. You educate them, inform their discretion by education. True constitutional solutions there. Another amendment proposal that came out of this mock convention, they called the Federal Legislative and Executive Jurisdiction Proposal Number 2. In this one, they want to give state legislatures the power to overturn federal law. Here's how it reads. "The legislatures of the state shall have the authority to abrogate," think of the word veto or overturn, "to abrogate any provision of federal law issued by Congress, the President, or the administrative agencies of the United States, whether in the form of a statute, decree, order, regulation, rule, opinion, decision, or other form." Let me ask you, Where in the Constitution does it authorize the president or the administrative agencies to be creating federal law? It does not. In fact, this would expand federal power by overturning Article 1, Section 1, which declares only Congress has the power to declare, only Congress has the power to create law. If we were to pass this amendment, you are now giving tacit approval for the president and administrative agencies to legitimately create law anytime they wish, and as long as the states don't stand up to it, it is now legitimate constitutional law. We accidentally just expanded federal power. The next clause is also concerning. Section 2 says, such abrogation shall be effective when the legislatures of 3/5 of the states, or 30 states, approve a resolution declaring the same provision or provisions of federal law to be abrogated. What is that saying? It takes 30 states to overturn any federal law. If we had this amendment on the books in 2005, we would have lost the battle over the Real ID Act of 2005. What did happen? Without this amendment in place, 12 states stood up and said, we refuse to implement the Real ID Act. The Real ID Act was very unpopular. This is a national ID card with a national database of a lot of personal information that people were very leery of the federal government collecting on them. And so there was definitely a groundswell movement to oppose it. 12 states refused to implement it, and when the deadline came along for implementation, the federal government backed down, extended the deadline. Again and again and again, they've extended that deadline. Because as long as you have enough states standing up saying no, they know they cannot win that battle. Instead of that, this amendment proposal weakens state power by requiring 30 states to nullify. If this was on the books at that time, the 12 states standing up to the Real ID Act would have lost. The federal government would all they'd have to do is say, that's nice that you're opposing it, but until you have 30, you must comply. This is weakening the power of states to nullify unconstitutional federal law. I don't suppose that these errors in this amendment were intentional. Again, this is like love poets trying to do heart surgery. If they don't truly and deeply understand the Constitution as it now stands, unintentional errors are bound to happen. Now, often they'll make a defense that, yes, but we were only there for 3 days. We didn't really have enough time to properly vet these amendment proposals. And that's not exactly true, because these amendment proposals have been circulating for years prior to the mock convention. I've been writing articles and speaking out against these amendment proposals long before they were brought up in the mock convention. These are not new ideas, and despite my showing the flaws in them, they're still pushing them. So there's some concern there as well. By the way, this one also passed with a large majority. 86% thought this was a good idea. Now, on the topic of the Real ID Act, just for a quick side note, here's a great article from Cato saying, no, America, you don't need to comply with the Real ID Act. Every few years, you'll see the federal government push, starting the beginning of next year, citizens from the following states will no longer be able to fly on the airlines unless their state now starts to comply with the national ID card standards. The point of this article is, as long as those states continue to stand up saying no, the federal government does not have the political capital to push this issue. They would be pushing it through the TSA, probably one of the most politically unpopular federal agencies. And ultimately what would happen if suddenly, a half a dozen or more states are being blocked from flying on the airlines, who's going to lose that battle? That'll be the TSA. The public opinion against TSA would soar, and they would be forced to reconsider or disband the TSA if they kept pushing the issue. That's the point of this article. Great article. We don't need to be conned into this. Now, there's another proposal that's being pushed constantly from several different angles, and that is a balanced budget amendment. Presently, at the time of filming this video, we have 28 states who have applications that are live, applying for an Article 5 convention for the purpose of a balanced budget amendment. And if we were to try to balance the budget today, under current numbers, we have roughly a $4 trillion annual budget, and the current revenue level is about $3.6 trillion. So we have a budgetary shortfall on average right around $400 billion. If we were to declare that the federal government must balance the budget, here's the effect of that. You're now declaring as long as they spend within the revenue, it is authorized by the Constitution. You're now making constitutional expenditures on anything as long as it's being met by the revenue. Now, of course, the federal government isn't likely to just trim back their spending to match revenue. They're far more likely to try to raise taxes to meet current levels of spending. We've accomplished nothing at that point other than an increase in taxes. And the big concern is this now constitutionally authorizes spending on anything, regardless of if it's authorized by the enumeration of powers or not. This replaces the constitutional limits on spending and jurisdiction, allowing the federal government to do anything they want as long as they've raised the revenue to pay for it. That doesn't help things, but there's a bigger concern here. These amendment applications include a loophole that in the absence of a national emergency, Congress would be required to balance the budget. When was the last time we had a national emergency? The answer is to check your watch right now, because it is right now. We're under roughly 30 declared national emergencies presently. And as this article demonstrates, from USA Today, special report, America's perpetual state of emergency. It points out that not only are we under roughly 30 simultaneous national emergency declarations, we have continually been under emergency state since 1979. Which begs the question, if we had passed this balanced budget amendment requirement back in the 80s when they almost were to the point of having enough states to do so, how many budgetary years since 1983, say, would they have been required to balance the budget because we were not under a national emergency? The answer, of course, is 0. There would not have been one moment that the balanced budget amendment requirement would have actually required a balanced budget. So not only are we authorizing Congress to spend on anything they want to, we're also not requiring them to balance the budget. And looking forward, if you add this incentive that as long as we're under a national emergency, Congress can keep spending all they want to, I guarantee we're going to stay under a national emergency indefinitely. This is an amendment proposal that will accomplish no good. There's no upside to it. On the other hand, what does the Constitution already require? Current federal spending around $4 trillion, revenue around 3.6. And if we were to rein in the federal government to what is actually authorized by the Constitution, you're looking at about 20% of our current spending levels, giving us a roughly $2.8 trillion surplus annually if we were to rein in the federal government back to what the Constitution actually authorizes. The solution here is enforce constitutional limits of power, and we'll get far more than a balanced budget. We'll have a surplus. Now, you remember I mentioned that this mock convention had a massive amount of moderates? No, 4 Democrats. Massive amount of conservatives and Republicans. What would a real convention look like? Which will largely be dominated by moderates and liberals. Even the more conservative states, I live in Montana, considered a conservative state. Ask any conservative legislator who your state legislators would select as a delegate to this convention. Would it be the conservatives or the more moderate and liberals? And they all agree they're going to be selecting moderates and liberals. That's what's going to dominate this convention. So what would that convention look like? Here's one idea. A former Justice of the Supreme Court, John Paul Stevens, suggests 5 words that can fix the Second Amendment. I didn't know it needed to be fixed, but he thinks so. He suggests that the Second Amendment should now read, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, when serving in the military or the militia, shall not be infringed. Which means that unless you're under active duty, you have no right to bear arms. That effectively repeals the Second Amendment by just adding 5 words to it. That is one angle, one suggestion that's being promoted right now. On a liberal blog that I was on recently, where they're also promoting an Article 5 convention, they're discussing this. One of the things they said is, yeah, we agree with this idea of having term limits on Congress, but you're going to have a major concession. We are not leaving the Constitutional Convention, no matter what the purpose it was called for, without also securing a campaign finance reform amendment and abolishing the Electoral College. It doesn't matter if we call this convention for a balanced budget amendment or whatever else, term limits. We're not leaving unless we get our way, is what they're telling us. Campaign finance reform amendment, this is one that's being supported by Wolf-PAC and George Soros' organizations. saying we need to overturn Citizens United Supreme Court ruling, make all elections publicly funded through taxpayer dollars, which makes government the gatekeeper of who qualifies for campaign funding. The other one, abolishing the Electoral College, should definitely be a big concern, especially to the smaller states. This would really allow New York and California to dominate the presidential elections, giving very little voice to the rest of the country. Both very dangerous ideas. You have to keep in mind, in 1787, there was the Great Compromise for the Constitution between the big states and the small states. The Great Compromise was the Senate will still represent every state equally, the House will represent based on population. What would be the Great Compromise if we held a convention today? Because we're not getting conservative-sounding amendments through without giving something to the liberal side as well. It's going to be a great compromise, and as I've demonstrated, the conservative amendments being proposed don't solve the problems. But in order to get those, we're going to have to give up some things to the other side as well. So, I frequently come to this. People finally, there's no way they can argue what I'm telling them. Yes, I admit, okay, the convention is a dangerous process, but we have to do something. And I hear many state legislators feeling like they're going to vote for it anyway, even though they see all the dangers and this could be a catastrophe. We have to do something. Again, wisdom from our founding fathers. Daniel Webster says, a strong conviction that something must be done is the parent of many bad measures. Don't be so desperate to do something that we do something foolish. Let us be wise in the action we take. Let's look to the founding fathers. They did give us many good solutions, powers that we already have to rein in the federal government.